It was one of those Portland nights when the rain didn't just fall, it pierced the skin like needles. I still remember the way the wind howled through the narrow alley behind our apartment building, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and rotting trash. Chloe tugged at my hand as we hurried past the dumpsters, her little boots splashing through puddles. She was only 6, but her eyes caught things mine had long trained themselves to ignore. "Mom, look!" Her voice cut through the storm. She pulled free and darted toward a dark corner by the bins. I followed, heart pounding, and saw what had stopped her in her tracks. A small cat lay crumpled on the ground, its fur soaked and matted, one paw bent at an unnatural angle. When Chloe reached out, the animal flinched weakly, letting out a sound that was half hiss, half cry. I crouched down and saw the gash across its flank, the telltale puncture wounds of a dog attack. The blood had thinned in the rain, streaking its ginger coat like rust. "Mom, he's hurt," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't leave him here. He'll die." I bit my lip. She didn't understand. We could barely keep ourselves warm and fed in that damp basement we called home. Our rent was already a struggle, and pets weren't even allowed. One more living mouth to care for wasn't something I could afford. But as I looked at Chloe's wide, tear-brimmed eyes, I saw more than pity for a stray cat. I saw the desperation of a child who wanted to save something because she couldn't save the life she was living. I opened my mouth to tell her no, to explain how the world worked, that sometimes you walked away because you had no other choice. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I slipped off my scarf, wrapped it around the shivering animal, and lifted it gently into my arms. Its fragile body was shockingly light, every rib pressing against my palms. Chloe's face lit up through the rain. She pressed her cheek against the bundle as we hurried back to the basement. Our home was nothing more than a converted storage room beneath a sagging apartment building. The ceiling leaked, the air smelled of mildew, and the single barred window looked out onto nothing but concrete. Still, it was all we had. I laid the cat on an old blanket while Chloe knelt beside it, whispering soothing words as though her voice alone could keep it alive. I searched our meager belongings for anything useful. An old towel, a chipped bowl I filled with water. As I worked, my mind drifted back, unbidden, to the long chain of choices and misfortunes that had brought me here. The parents I'd lost too young, the education I couldn't finish, the man I loved and buried before Chloe was even born. I shook off the memory and focused on the animal before me. Its eyes, amber and glassy, followed my every movement. It was clinging to life with the same stubbornness I knew too well. Chloe stroked the cat's damp fur and looked up at me with a smile that pierced through the gloom. "Mom," she said softly, "his fur is the color of gingerbread. That's what I'm going to call him." "Gingerbread," I repeated, the word strange but warm on my tongue. In that moment, I realized that in saving this cat, Chloe had found a little hope for herself too. And maybe, just maybe, so had I. When I was little, I thought my life would follow the steady path my parents laid out for me. My father was a soldier, the kind of man who stood tall in every photograph, his uniform pressed and his smile just a little too proud. My mother was a librarian, quiet and gentle, her world built from shelves of books and the whispered stories she passed along to me before bed. Together, they made me believe the world could be safe, that as long as we had each other, nothing could break us. That illusion shattered when I was 9. My father didn't come home from a mission. All we got was a folded flag and words of honor that did nothing to fill the empty chair at our table. My mother tried to be strong, but grief weighed on her fragile frame. By the time I was 15, illness had claimed her too. Watching her fade away was like watching the light in my own world flicker and die. When she was gone, the little 2-bedroom apartment we had in subsidized housing was taken back by the state. I remember standing on the cracked sidewalk with a garbage bag full of clothes, staring at the building that had been my only home, and realizing I had nowhere else to go. I told myself I would keep pushing forward. I dreamed of becoming a journalist, someone who told the truth, someone who mattered. I even managed to enroll in college, clutching at that fragile hope. But tuition was merciless and scholarships only went so far. I worked part-time, skipped meals, studied late into the night, but no amount of effort could cover the bills. Eventually, I dropped out, another statistic in a system that didn't care. I took jobs wherever I could find them, waiting tables, cleaning, even bartending. That was where I met Jason. He wasn't perfect, but he had a kind of wild charm that pulled me in. He talked about escaping the grind, about finding shortcuts to a better life. For a while, I believed him. I let myself imagine we might claw our way out of the gutter together. Then one night, he didn't come home. I found out through whispers and half-truths he'd gotten tangled up in something dangerous. Some scheme that promised fast money, but ended in a body bag. He was gone before I could even say goodbye. In the days after, when I felt like I had nothing left, I discovered I was pregnant. I remember sitting on the edge of a worn mattress, the test clutched in my hands, staring at the 2 faint lines. My first instinct was fear. How could I possibly raise a child when I couldn't even take care of myself? For days, I considered every option, every escape. But deep down, I knew this baby was all I had left of Jason, and maybe the only reason I had left to keep going. So I chose her. I chose Chloe before she even had a name. It wasn't the life I dreamed of, but it was the life I had, and I would fight for it with everything in me. After Jason was gone, and the little savings I had evaporated, I found myself drifting from one borrowed couch to another, dragging my belongings in a duffel bag while carrying Chloe on my hip. Those days blur together in my memory. Bus rides that smelled of diesel, nights in shelters where the lights never dimmed, and mornings when I woke with a stiff neck from sleeping upright in a plastic chair. I clung to Chloe's tiny hand like it was the only anchor keeping me from sinking. One afternoon, when the rain felt endless, I crossed paths with a woman who changed everything. Her name was Lucille, an elderly widow who had lived in Portland her whole life. She found me outside a grocery store, Chloe shivering under my coat, both of us soaked through. Lucille had sharp eyes that didn't miss much, and after a long look, she pressed a warm cup of coffee into my hand and asked me about my life. By the end of that conversation, she offered me a chance, cleaning work in a downtown office building where she used to manage the staff. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. With that came a tiny room, a basement unit no one wanted. The walls were damp, paint peeling in uneven patches, and the single window was half buried beneath the sidewalk. From the street above, all we could see were shoes passing by and the occasional shadow. Still, it was ours. I spread out a mattress on the floor, hung a blanket to cover the cracked wall, and told Chloe it was a castle underground. She believed me. Life settled into a grueling rhythm. Every night, after tucking Chloe in, I dragged a mop and bucket through the echoing corridors of that office building. The fluorescent lights hummed above me. The smell of cleaning chemicals burned my nose, and I scrubbed until my arms ached. My hands cracked and bled from the bleach, but I kept working. Some of the office employees passed me in the hallways with tight smiles or dismissive glances, like I was part of the furniture. Others didn't see me at all. Back in the basement, Chloe would chatter about the day she would have her own room with pink curtains, or how she'd invite her friends over for sleepovers. I nodded and smiled, though my chest tightened with guilt. I wanted to give her everything, yet all I had was a damp mattress and a leaky ceiling. When gingerbread came into our lives, things shifted, if only a little. Chloe doted on him, wrapping him in scarves, feeding him scraps from our table, whispering secrets into his fur as though he could carry her worries away. Watching her laugh while he batted at a string made the basement feel less like a cage and more like a home. For the first time in a long time, hope curled quietly inside me. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep us going. Gingerbread's condition didn't improve the way I hoped. Despite my makeshift bandages and bowls of water, he grew weaker by the day. His paw hung limply, and his breathing turned shallow, rattling in the stillness of our basement. Chloe cried herself to sleep more than once, clutching him against her chest. I couldn't stand to watch her hope dim like that. So one rainy afternoon, I wrapped the little cat in an old blanket and told Chloe we were taking him to see a real doctor. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, she skipped beside me as we walked through the slick streets. The veterinary clinic wasn't far, a modest brick building with a painted paw print on the glass door. Inside, it smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh hay, a strange combination that instantly reminded me of both hospitals and barns. I hesitated at the front desk, my hand tightening on the blanket, unsure if I could even afford to stand there. That was when he appeared. "Can I help you?" His voice was calm, steady. I looked up to see a tall man in a white coat, his dark hair flecked with gray at the temples. His eyes, a deep hazel, softened when they fell on Chloe holding the bundle in her arms. "It's our cat," Chloe blurted, her voice urgent. "He's hurt really bad. Please, you have to fix him." I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain that I had no money, but the words tangled in my throat. The man, Dr. Jonathan Reed, as his badge read, took the bundle gently from Chloe's arms and peeled back the blanket. He examined Gingerbread with practiced hands, his brow furrowing. "He's been through a fight," Jonathan murmured, almost to himself. "But he's a fighter. Let's see what we can do." He carried the cat into the exam room, and without thinking, Chloe and I followed. I stood awkwardly in the corner, watching him work. His movements were precise but gentle, the way he cleaned the wound and set the broken paw. When Chloe asked questions, will it hurt him? Is he going to die? Jonathan answered with patience, never once brushing her aside. When he finally looked up, I braced myself for the question about payment. Instead, he smiled faintly. "No charge. He deserves a chance." The relief that swept over me was sharp enough to sting. I managed a weak thank you, but my cheeks burned with shame. I hated feeling like a charity case, hated that he probably saw me as nothing more than the cleaning woman from his building. Because I recognized him now. Jonathan lived in the very office tower where I scrubbed floors each night. I had seen him once or twice stepping out of the elevator, polished and professional, while I kept my head down with a mop in hand. I expected pity, maybe even discomfort, but what I saw in his expression was different. He didn't look at me like I was invisible. He looked at me like I mattered. Chloe, oblivious to my turmoil, sat cross-legged on the floor beside the exam table, her hand stroking Gingerbread's bandaged paw. She gazed up at Jonathan with absolute trust, as though he had descended like some kind of hero just for her. And in that quiet, sterile room, something shifted. I didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of a connection that would change the course of our lives. It didn't take long for trouble to find us. A week after Gingerbread came back from the clinic, our landlord showed up at the basement door. He was a heavy-set man with a permanent scowl, the kind who enjoyed reminding tenants of their place. "I heard meowing down here," he said, pushing past me before I could protest. His flashlight beam swept across the damp concrete floor until it landed on Chloe, who was cradling Gingerbread in her arms. The cat blinked sleepily at the intrusion. The landlord's mouth twisted into a sneer. "No pets. It's in the lease. You know the rules." I tried to explain, just a stray, we were helping, just temporary, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Either the cat goes or you both go. You've got until the end of the week." When he left, slamming the door behind him, I sank to the floor. Chloe rushed to my side, whispering that everything would be okay, but I could barely hear her. My chest felt like it was collapsing. I had fought so hard to give her even this meager shelter, and now it was about to be ripped away. That night, when Chloe fell asleep clutching Gingerbread, I cried quietly into my pillow. I had no backup plan, no savings, no family to call. The thought of dragging my daughter back to the shelters, of watching her sleep under flickering lights again, broke me in a way nothing else had. The next day, as I left work, I nearly walked straight into Jonathan. He was standing by the doorway, his hands in the pockets of his coat, as though he had been waiting. "You don't look okay," he said gently. I tried to brush it off, but the dam broke. Words spilled out about the landlord, about Chloe, about the cat that had become our only comfort. To my embarrassment, my voice cracked and tears slid down my cheeks. Jonathan didn't flinch. He just listened. Then, after a pause, he said the words that changed everything. "Come stay with me. Both of you. There's plenty of room." I shook my head immediately. "I can't. We'd be a burden. People would talk. And Maya," he interrupted softly. "You and Chloe need a safe place. That's what matters. Let me help." For a long moment, I stood frozen, pride warring with desperation. Every instinct told me not to accept charity, not to let anyone see how fragile I really was. But then I thought of Chloe, of the way her small body curled up against gingerbread each night, clinging to scraps of comfort. I couldn't let her lose that too, so I nodded. When we stepped into Jonathan's apartment for the first time, Chloe gasped. The windows were wide and bright, the walls painted in soft earth tones, the air free of mildew. She ran from room to room, her laughter echoing in a way I hadn't heard in years. I stood awkwardly in the doorway, clutching the strap of my bag. "We'll earn our keep," I said firmly. "I'll clean, cook, whatever you need." Jonathan only smiled. "You don't owe me anything." But I insisted, and from that day forward, I worked quietly around his home, polishing counters, folding laundry, finding ways to repay kindness I didn't feel I deserved. I had just begun to settle into the fragile rhythm of our new life when the storm arrived at Jonathan's door in the shape of his mother. Helen Reed was the kind of woman you noticed before she even spoke. Tall, impeccably dressed, her silver hair swept back from a face carved in sharp lines of authority. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent her life giving orders and expecting obedience. I first saw her standing in the doorway one Saturday morning, a designer handbag looped over her arm, her eyes narrowing the moment they landed on me. "And who exactly are you?" she asked, her tone clipped, as though I were a trespasser. Before I could answer, Chloe peeked from behind me, clutching gingerbread. Helen's gaze swept over her, then returned to me with something colder than disdain. It was calculation. Jonathan emerged from the kitchen, clearly caught off guard. "Mom, this is Maya. And that's her daughter, Chloe." Helen's eyebrows arched. "And why are they here? In your home?" I felt my face flush. Before Jonathan could speak, I tried to explain. Just temporary, just until I could find something else. But Helen cut me off with a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, I see. A single mother with a child and a sob story. Jonathan, really? You've always been too soft-hearted. This," she gestured at me with a wave of her manicured hand, "this is nothing but a gold digger who saw her chance." The words struck like a slap. I stood frozen, shame and anger warring inside me. I wanted to shout back, to tell her she didn't know me, didn't know the nights I'd spent scrubbing floors until my fingers bled, didn't know the hunger I'd hidden for my daughter. But the lump in my throat was too heavy. Jonathan's voice broke through my silence, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Enough, Mom." Helen blinked at him, clearly unaccustomed to resistance. "Maya is not what you think," he continued firmly. "She and Chloe needed help, and I wanted them here. That's my decision. And if you can't respect it, then maybe you should leave." For a moment, the room felt suspended in air. Helen's lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes flashing with fury. I could see the battle raging inside her, the need to control her son, the disbelief that he would defy her so openly. Finally, she turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood as she stalked out. The door slammed behind her, leaving silence in her wake. I stood there trembling, still clutching Chloe's hand. Jonathan crossed the room and laid his hand gently on my shoulder. "Don't listen to her," he said softly. "I know who you are." For the first time, I believed he really did. In that moment, the line was drawn. Helen Reed was no longer just Jonathan's mother. She was the shadow looming over us, the villain who would stop at nothing to tear apart the fragile happiness we were building. The weeks that followed Helen's outburst should have been unbearable, but inside Jonathan's apartment, life began to take on a different rhythm. Each day felt like we were building something small and fragile, brick by brick. Jonathan would come home from the clinic in the evenings, his coat damp from the Portland rain, and we'd share simple dinners at the kitchen table, meatloaf, soup, whatever I could piece together from the groceries he insisted on stocking. Chloe would chatter endlessly about school, about Gingerbread's antics, about dreams she didn't yet realize were too big for a basement world. Jonathan listened to her with the same patience he gave his patients, nodding as if every word mattered. When Chloe went to bed, Jonathan and I would linger. At first, it was small talk, surface level, careful. But slowly the walls came down. One night, his voice grew quiet as he told me about his wife. Her name had been Claire. She died in a car accident 5 years earlier, a sudden and senseless loss that had gutted him. He admitted he hadn't let anyone close since. I remember sitting there in the dim glow of the kitchen lamp, listening to the way his voice cracked, the grief still raw beneath his steady exterior. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in my pain. Our tragedies were different, but the hollow spaces they left inside us felt eerily the same. In return, I told him pieces of my own story, the parents I lost, the dreams I'd buried, Jason, and the heartbreak that left me raising Chloe alone. His eyes didn't hold pity when I spoke. They held understanding, a quiet recognition that settled into my bones like warmth after a long chill. The nights grew longer, the rain heavier, but inside those walls, I found something I hadn't dared hope for: peace. On New Year's Eve, we stayed in. Chloe insisted on making decorations from scraps of colored paper, taping them to the windows while Gingerbread pawed at the falling confetti. At midnight, as fireworks cracked faintly in the distance, Chloe squeezed between us on the couch, her small voice carrying more weight than she knew. "I want us to always be together," she whispered, her eyes shining with the kind of hope only a child could summon. "Me, Mom, and you, Jonathan." I froze, my heart lodged in my throat. Jonathan looked at her, then at me. And in that moment, something in his gaze shifted, resolve, tenderness, something more than either of us had dared to name. He reached into his pocket, and before I could breathe, he held out a simple silver ring. "Maya," he said softly, "I don't want this to be temporary. I want us to build a life together. Will you marry me?" My hands shook as tears blurred my vision. Chloe gasped, her smile wide enough to light the whole room. I said yes, and for the first time in so many years, happiness didn't feel like something borrowed. It felt like it belonged to me. Our wedding wasn't the kind people write about in magazines. There were no chandeliers, no grand halls, no orchestra swelling as I walked down the aisle. It was small, intimate, just a few close friends from Jonathan's clinic, Lucille, and Chloe bouncing excitedly in her dress as flower petals stuck to her shoes. We stood under the arch of a community garden, Portland rain misting lightly against a canopy of twinkling string lights. I wore a simple cream dress borrowed from a neighbor, and Jonathan looked almost boyish in his gray suit, the lines of grief and responsibility softened by joy. When we exchanged vows, Chloe squeezed between us, her tiny hands clutching both of ours. As Jonathan slipped the ring onto my finger, Chloe's voice broke through, trembling with sincerity. "Can I call you Dad now?" she asked, her eyes wide, her lips trembling in that way that made my chest ache. Jonathan crouched down to her level, tears welling in his eyes. "Only if you really want to," he whispered. She threw her arms around his neck. "I do. You're my dad." I will never forget the look on his face in that moment. Relief, love, and the silent promise that he would never let her down. After that day, life settled into something I had only dared to dream about. Chloe had her own sunny room with shelves for her books and toys. Gingerbread stretched lazily across the windowsill, fattening from the treats Chloe snuck him. And I, for the first time in years, had the luxury of thinking about something beyond survival. It started almost as a joke. I wrote little blog posts about Gingerbread's recovery, Chloe's imaginative games with him, the way he strutted around the apartment as if he were king. I posted pictures, Chloe hugging him, Gingerbread balancing on the edge of a chair, even his mischievous habit of knocking pens off Jonathan's desk. I thought only a handful of people would ever see them, but within weeks the blog exploded. Messages poured in from strangers who said Gingerbread's story gave them hope, that our little family reminded them not to give up. I didn't earn money from it, not at first, but the validation meant something. For once, people weren't looking down on me as the cleaning woman, the single mother in a damp basement. They saw me as someone who had endured, someone who mattered. Jonathan encouraged me, often sitting beside me in the evenings as I typed, his hand brushing mine, his smile full of pride. Chloe loved reading the comments aloud, giggling when someone called Gingerbread a miracle cat. Those were golden days, fragile and fleeting. I let myself believe they would last. But Helen never congratulated us, never smiled at Chloe calling Jonathan Dad. She came to the wedding but stayed stiff, her eyes sharp as glass, her hands folded like clenched fists. And afterward, though she visited less often, I felt her presence like a shadow pressing against the walls. I should have known peace like ours could never exist without a storm following close behind. It was a gray afternoon, the kind when the Portland rain seemed determined to seep into every crack of the city. Jonathan was still at the clinic finishing late appointments, and Chloe was upstairs in her room drawing. I was folding laundry when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Helen standing there, dressed immaculately as always, a polished smile plastered across her face. In her hands, she carried a box of pastries and a tin of tea. "I thought I'd drop by," she said smoothly, though her tone carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Just a little peace offering. Every instinct told me to keep the door closed, but politeness, or perhaps naivety, made me step aside. She breezed past me, her perfume filling the air, and settled herself at the dining table as though she owned it. "I brought your favorite chamomile," she said, placing the tin on the table. "Why don't we share a cup? Just the two of us. It's time we learned to get along." I moved to the kitchen, my pulse quickening. As I boiled water, I caught sight of her in the hallway mirror that hung just at the right angle to reflect the table. Helen's face was tight with focus as she pulled a small vial from her handbag. My breath caught in my throat. With a quick glance toward the kitchen, she tipped a few drops of something clear into one of the cups before sliding the vial back into her bag. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed denial. It couldn't be what I thought. But the image of the liquid swirling in the cup was undeniable. My hands trembled as I carried the tray back into the room. "Here we are," I said, forcing my voice steady as I set the cups down. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Helen slid the tainted cup toward me with a faint smile. "To new beginnings," she said. In that instant, survival instincts I didn't know I had took over. I shifted the cups, pretending to adjust the saucers, and placed the poisoned one in front of her instead. She raised it to her lips without hesitation. The first sip was followed by a faint frown, then a cough. Within minutes, her face blanched, her hand clutching at her chest. The teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. "Chloe!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Stay upstairs. Call 911. I knelt beside Helen as her body convulsed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Sirens wailed in the distance minutes later, though they felt like hours. The paramedics rushed in, lifting her onto a stretcher, their radios crackling with urgency. At the hospital, toxicology tests confirmed what I already knew: poison. The police arrived soon after, asking questions, combing through the apartment. They found the vial still in her handbag, fingerprints all over it. There was no denying it. When Jonathan finally arrived, the color drained from his face as the officers explained. He sat heavily in a chair, his hands pressed against his temples, disbelief etched into every line of his face. I stood nearby, numb. The woman who had despised me from the beginning had just tried to kill me, and nearly killed herself instead. It was the moment our fragile peace shattered completely, leaving nothing but fear, betrayal, and a truth too sharp to ignore. Helen survived, though the doctors said it was a narrow escape. When she finally regained strength enough to speak, the police were already waiting. I was there too, standing just outside the hospital room with Jonathan's hand clasped tightly in mine. What she revealed that day shook us both to the core. "It wasn't my idea," she whispered hoarsely, her eyes darting between us. "It was Amanda. She told me you'd never belong to me again if Maya stayed in your life. She said if I didn't act, I'd lose you forever." Jonathan stiffened beside me. Amanda Brooks, his childhood friend, the one who had hovered at family gatherings, who always seemed to find reasons to call him, who looked at me with barely concealed disdain. Suddenly, her subtle digs, her offers to help out, all of it made a sinister kind of sense. The detectives pressed her for details, and the whole story unraveled. Amanda had fed Helen poison, disguised as herbal supplements, telling her it would help calm her nerves, then urged her to use it against me. She had fueled Helen's fear of losing her son until it twisted into something reckless. But the investigation didn't stop there. Digging deeper, the police uncovered something even darker. Amanda's fingerprints and phone records connected her to the accident that killed Jonathan's first wife. What had always been written off as a tragic twist of fate now had a face and a motive. Amanda had wanted Jonathan for herself for years, and she'd been willing to destroy anyone in her path to get him. I watched Jonathan's face as the truth sank in. His grief for Claire, his anger at Amanda, his devastation at his own mother's betrayal, all of it collided in his eyes. I reached for his hand, and he clung to mine as though it was the only steady thing left in his world. Amanda was arrested. I'll never forget the sight of her being led out of the Reed house in handcuffs, her once carefully constructed image in ruins. For me, it was justice, but for Jonathan, it was something closer to release, a terrible weight he'd carried for years, finally lifted, even if it came with new scars. Helen changed after that. She wept when she realized she had been nothing more than a pawn in Amanda's cruelty. For weeks, she apologized to me, to Jonathan, to Chloe. I didn't forgive her immediately. Trust isn't something you rebuild with words alone. But when I saw her cradle our newborn son months later, tears streaming down her face as she whispered promises into his tiny ears, I knew she was trying. And that had to be enough. Life moved forward. Chloe thrived in school, proudly introducing herself as Jonathan's daughter. Gingerbread lounged like a king across the back of the couch, his once broken body now strong and sleek. My blog grew into something bigger than I ever expected, and with Jonathan's encouragement, I turned it into a real career. And me, I grew too. For years, I had lived in basements and shadows, believing love and stability were things other people had. But standing in her home, with Jonathan's arms around me, Chloe laughing in the yard, and the baby cooing in Helen's embrace, I finally felt what it meant to belong. Our journey hadn't been easy. It had been full of storms, betrayals, and near disasters. But somehow, through it all, we found our way to healing. And in that healing, we found our revenge, not by destroying those who hurt us, but by living the life they never thought we deserved. We were a family. At last. "You're just a baby carrier today. Look pretty. Stay quiet." Those were the words Ethan whispered into my ear while smiling at the crowd, his hand resting lightly on my back as if we were the picture-perfect couple. I stood there holding our 7-month-old daughter Sophie on my hip, her soft head resting against my collarbone, completely unaware that her father had just turned me into furniture. The sun was warm that day, pouring over the Charleston countryside like honey. Golden light spilled through the canopy strung above the white linen tables, where floral centerpieces swayed gently in the breeze. It was Nathan's wedding, Ethan's younger brother, and not a single expense had been spared. Everything gleamed, the crystal, the chairs, the smiles, but none of it reached me. Not after what he said. I hadn't even wanted to come. Sophie was teething. I hadn't slept in 3 nights, and Ethan had barely looked at me all week, except to criticize. I had suggested staying home. His answer was a clipped command. It's my brother's wedding. No drama. Be presentable. So I stood in front of the mirror that morning with cracked lips and shadows under my eyes, pulling my hair back into a low chignon, applying foundation to hide the fatigue, and slipping into the navy dress he chose. Not because it flattered me, but because it matched his tie. At the venue, he was all charm, laughing with Nathan, clinking glasses, making toasts. I was the silent shadow beside him, balancing Sophie and a forced smile. I reached for his hand once, absent-mindedly, just to feel something tethering me to the man I used to know. His fingers twitched beneath mine, and he recoiled like I'd burned him. Then he leaned in, voice smooth but lethal. You're just a baby carrier today. And just like that, I disappeared. I felt it, like someone had taken a match to everything human inside me and watched it burn to ash. I looked around at the wives in their pressed dresses and polished hair, smiling at nothing, sipping champagne. Were they happy? Or were they, like me, just well-trained? I didn't cry. Not then. I just adjusted Sophie against my hip and sat through the ceremony with my jaw tight and my mind reeling. Every word spoken up at that altar about love and commitment and seeing each other fully, I let it slide over me like water over stone. I had seen Ethan. I had loved him. And now I couldn't even reach for his hand without being treated like a prop. The reception was a blur of speeches and silverware. His mother spoke first, nostalgic and teary. His father followed with dry jokes that drew polite laughter. Then Ethan stood, confident and articulate, speaking about loyalty and legacy, his voice strong and sure. People clapped. I smiled hollow. Then the microphone was passed down the table, unexpected, casual. Would you like to say a few words? Nathan grinned, gesturing to me. I froze. For a moment, I thought I misheard. But the mic was in front of me now, cold, heavy. I glanced at Ethan. His smile had vanished. He leaned in, voice tight. You don't have to. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. But I stood. The mic felt foreign in my hand, slick, a little too cold, as though it knew this moment wasn't meant to belong to me. My heart pounded, loud and arrhythmic, drowning out the clinking of glasses and shuffling of chairs. The music had faded, the laughter had stopped. Only Sophie made a soft, gurgling noise in the distance, oblivious to the storm I was about to unleash. My voice came out smaller than I'd intended. I cleared my throat, steadying myself. Thank you for having me speak, I began, forcing a polite smile. I wasn't planning to, but weddings are moments, aren't they? Moments we never forget. A few polite nods. A waiter froze mid-step. I remember my own wedding, I continued, my eyes brushing past Ethan, whose jaw had tightened into a near snarl. I was 26, nervous, hopeful. I thought I was marrying someone who saw me. Someone at the far table shifted, scraping a shoe softly across the wooden floor. I imagined the rest of our life together. Sundays with pancakes, whispered baby names, shared grocery lists, jokes only we would get. I imagined love would stay as long as we fed it. I let out a soft laugh. But sometimes life surprises you. Sometimes you wake up and realize you've become background noise in your own story. Now there was real silence, the kind you can feel in your bones. Sophie let out a small coo, and someone, maybe Ethan's cousin, stood to pick her up, as if trying to distract from the rising discomfort. You stop being a partner, I said, my voice steady now, and start becoming useful. You make the meals, wipe the counters, soothe the babies, Host the in-laws smile on cue. You're not seen. You're expected. I turned to Nathan and his new bride, keeping my tone even but my words sharp. My only hope for you, truly, is that you never forget to look at each other. Really look. Not just on anniversaries or when things are easy, but in the chaos, in the fatigue, in the days when you forget why you started. My eyes returned to Ethan. His smile was long gone now. In its place was a fury he couldn't hide behind charm. Because the moment you stop seeing each other, I said, it's not a marriage anymore. It's a performance. No one clapped. No one breathed. I handed the microphone back to the stunned wedding planner and stepped down slowly, my heels echoing against the wooden floor like punctuation marks. I didn't look at Ethan. I didn't need to. I just walked toward Sophie. She was with Ethan's cousin Maria now, looking up at me with that gummy grin, her tiny fingers outstretched. I lifted her into my arms and kissed the top of her head, letting her warmth fill the hollow space in my chest. Ethan didn't follow me. Not right away. I walked out of the reception hall, past the valet, past the fairy lights, and the Instagram-perfect tables. I kept walking until the music was just a whisper behind me, and the cool air bit at my skin. The parking lot was nearly empty, bathed in soft amber light. I stood near the hedges, rocking Sophie slowly, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of finally being heard. Then I heard the footsteps. The footsteps were fast and deliberate, heavy against the pavement. I didn't turn around. I knew it was him before he spoke. What the hell was that? Ethan hissed. His voice was low, sharp, and too close. Are you insane? I turned slowly, adjusting Sophie in my arms. I told the truth. He stepped forward, towering over me. His suit was still perfect, his tie crisp, but his eyes, those carefully curated politician's eyes, were wild now. You just humiliated me in front of my entire family, he growled. I looked up at him, my voice steady. No, I reminded them that I exist. He flinched, just slightly, like I'd slapped him. Then he composed himself. Go home. Now, he said, each word clipped final. We'll talk later. He didn't offer to take Sophie, didn't glance at her or ask if she was okay. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the venue, back to the glittering celebration, as if he hadn't just left a woman unraveling in the shadows. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he'd been, feeling like the cold had finally reached inside my bones. Then I opened the car door, buckled Sophie into her seat, and slid behind the wheel. She babbled softly, playing with the strap of her carrier, blissfully unaware. As I pulled out of the lot, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if Ethan was watching. The streets of Charleston were quiet, glowing faintly under the street lamps. I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on my lap, feeling the sting of tears that refused to fall, until they did, silent, endless. And for the first time in years, I didn't wipe them away. When we reached the house, I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, listening to Sophie's gentle breathing. Then I carried her inside, past the porch swing Ethan never used, through the hallway where our wedding photo still hung. Two smiling strangers in love with a fantasy. The kitchen light buzzed overhead as I made a bottle and rocked her to sleep. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. I just stood there in the nursery, her soft breath against my shoulder, and stared out the window into the quiet night. The next morning, Ethan acted like nothing had happened. He poured himself coffee, kissed Sophie's forehead, and opened his phone like it was just another Sunday, like I hadn't pulled the curtain back the night before and shown everyone who he really was. I stood by the sink, watching him, my fingers tight around a dish towel. I'm going to the gym, he said, flatly, not looking at me. My parents are coming by at 3. Try not to bring up last night. I blinked. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just dismissal. He paused when he reached the door, sensing I hadn't moved. What else is there? He asked. I didn't answer, because I realized he genuinely didn't see anything wrong. Richard Carter didn't deal in apologies. Not for me. Not anymore. He hadn't always been like this. Once he was magnetic, sharp suits and quick wit, the kind of man who made you feel like the only person in the room. He used to notice things. The way I chewed my pen when I was nervous. The books I reread but never finished. The songs I hummed when I cooked. But something had shifted after we married. Slowly, like a temperature dropping 1 degree at a time until you're frozen before you know you're cold. It started with small corrections. You didn't say that quite right. Then the quiet refusals. No more hand-holding in public. No photos together unless he initiated. And when I got pregnant, something in him calcified. Not angry. Not cruel. Just indifferent. Like I had become less useful. A burden to manage. When Sophie was born, he held her once. Said he was afraid of doing it wrong. He never tried again. And so I did everything. The feedings. The laundry. The doctor's appointments. The nights when Sophie wouldn't sleep unless I walked the hallway with her for hours. I did it all. Because someone had to. That afternoon, Ethan's parents came by with a bottle of wine and tight smiles. I wore the same polite mask I'd worn for months, smiling just enough, nodding at the right moments, pretending not to notice the way Ethan's mother studied me, like I was a mess she couldn't quite clean up. "You were so quiet at the wedding," she said over a glass of white wine. Very tasteful. That little speech really got people talking. Across the room, Ethan's jaw flexed. I offered a small nod. Sometimes honesty makes people uncomfortable. She blinked, setting her glass down with a soft clink. Oh, it was honesty. There was no malice in her tone, just that familiar, paper-thin disapproval she had mastered over the years. I wondered if she had ever spoken out against her own husband. Probably not. Women in their family were trained to smile through bruises, visible or not. After they left, Ethan didn't say a word. He sat on the couch, flicking through channels while I bathed Sophie, sang her to sleep, folded the laundry, wiped down the kitchen counters. I moved through the house like a ghost in a place I used to call home. At midnight, I found him on the back porch, staring out into the dark yard with a drink in his hand. I stepped outside, the wooden boards creaking beneath my feet. I meant what I said yesterday. I told him quietly. He didn't turn around. "You made me look like a fool." "No," I said. "You made me feel like a ghost." He finally turned, his expression unreadable. "You think you're a martyr now, is that it?" I shook my head. "No, I'm just done being invisible." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You're not going anywhere. You need me. You have no job, no savings, no plan. You're stuck." He said it calmly, like he was stating a simple fact. Like gravity. I didn't respond. I just turned, walked inside, and closed the door. But in bed that night, lying stiffly beside the man who couldn't see me anymore, I let myself imagine it. A life without him. It was terrifying, uncertain, but it was mine. The next morning, while Sophie napped and the house was silent, I opened my old laptop. It took a full minute to boot. My hands hovered over the keys like they weren't mine. Then I opened the design software I hadn't touched in over a year. And I cried, not because I was sad, but because something inside me, something that had been buried under diapers and dinner plates and silence, finally stirred. It was the smallest thing, but it was mine. That night, I created a new email, updated my portfolio. Nothing dramatic, just quiet steps in the dark. A week later, a notification lit up my inbox. An old client from before Sophie was born, a bakery in Vermont. They'd accidentally left me on an auto-pay plan, and $184 had just landed in my bank account. It felt like a miracle. I emailed them, offering to refund the charge. Instead, they asked if I could refresh their logo. I said yes. The project wasn't glamorous. The pay was minimal. But I worked on it at night in between feedings and cleaning bottles, sipping weak coffee and pushing pixels around until something clicked. When I sent the final files, the the owner emailed me back within an hour. "This is beautiful. You really understood what I wanted. Thank you." I stared at the message for a long time. No one had thanked me in months, maybe years. Not for being a wife, not for being a mother, not for folding socks or remembering pediatrician appointments or always having the fridge stocked. Just thank you. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't need to. I wasn't doing it for him. For the first time in forever, I was doing something that made me feel real. A few days later, I got a message on Facebook. "Hey, saw your name on a client site. Are you still doing freelance work?" Jessica. Lynn, my breath caught. Jessica. We hadn't spoken in 6 years, not since college. We'd both studied design. She was the type of girl who always had ink on her hands and wild ideas in her sketchbook. We used to talk about opening our own agency one day, working late in a glass-walled office in New York, drinking bad coffee, and making beautiful things. I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back before I could second-guess myself. "Yes, late nights mostly. Baby at home. Want to catch up?" She replied within minutes. "Absolutely. I'm in Charleston for the week. Coffee? Your call." My stomach flipped. Ethan wouldn't like this. He never liked me reconnecting with people who knew me before. Especially women. Especially ambitious ones. Still, I said yes. We met at a coffee shop near the public library, neutral territory. I wore makeup for the first time in months. Not for beauty. For armor. To remind myself that I still had a face beneath the fatigue. Jessica looked almost exactly the same. Wavy hair pulled into a loose bun. Eyes full of light. Laughter that filled the room. "You look good," she said, hugging me tightly. "Tired, but good." I smiled. That's motherhood. We talked about old classmates, favorite professors, failed startups. I gave her the sanitized version of my life, the one I'd repeated so many times it almost sounded real. Married, baby, freelancing a bit here and there. She listened carefully, nodding, sipping her chai latte. Then, after a beat, she leaned in, voice softer. "You okay?" I hesitated. "I don't mean to pry," she said quickly. "You just seem like someone who's holding her breath." I stared at her. The question cracked something open in me. "I'm just trying to get back to myself," I said, barely above a whisper. Her eyes softened. She reached for her phone, tapped something, then looked up. "If you ever need help, real help, let me know. My firm has a daycare stipend. We hire remote designers sometimes. I can float your name." I blinked. "You do that?" She smiled. "You were the best in our class. I always thought you gave up too early." That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the version of me who dreamed in color, the one who stayed up past midnight designing album covers no one asked for, the one who once said, "I don't want to be someone's wife first. I want to be my own damn person." 2 days later, I sent Jessica my resume. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't even plan to. Not yet. But I knew he'd find out eventually. And when he did, it happened exactly how I expected. A client invoice arrived in the mail. He held it up like it was evidence in a trial. "What's this?" "A payment," I said calmly, "for a project I'm working on. You're working now." I never stopped being able to work. His jaw clenched. "You should have talked to me." "I did," I said, meeting his eyes. "You just didn't listen." He didn't reply. He just walked out of the room, not yelling, not slamming anything. And somehow, that terrified me more than rage ever could. Later that night, I double-checked the locks, every one of them. Then I emailed Jessica. "I'm interested. Please keep me in mind." Her reply came almost immediately. "Already did. Interview next week. You've got this." The interview was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. I put Sophie down for her nap 30 minutes early, praying she'd stay asleep just long enough. Then I pulled on the white blouse I hadn't touched since before I got pregnant, creased at the shoulders, slightly loose now, but it made me feel like someone who still had somewhere to be. I set up my laptop in the only corner of the house where Ethan's presence didn't linger, by the bookshelf next to the old window with the peeling paint and the view of the neighbor's dogwood tree. At 9:59, the Zoom call connected. The woman on the screen was in her 40s, maybe, with warm eyes and a sleek pixie cut. Her name was Elise Monroe, senior creative director at the firm Jessica worked for. She smiled as soon as my camera turned on. "Olivia Hart," she said, "I've heard a lot about you." I smiled, nerves tight in my chest. "Hopefully good things." "Oh, good," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Let's talk design." And just like that, the world shifted. For 30 minutes, we talked about color theory and branding voice, about user experience and typography trends. She didn't ask about my gap year. She didn't ask why my portfolio had a sudden drop-off in 2022. She asked about instinct, about problem solving, about how I made people feel with what I created. And for the first time in years, I wasn't a wife. I wasn't a mother. I was just me. When the interview ended, Elise smiled again. "We'll be in touch soon," she said, then added with a wink, "but I'll tell you now, Jessica's recommendation carried a lot of weight." As soon as the call ended, I sat there frozen, staring at the blank Zoom screen. Then I exhaled so deeply I startled myself. From the baby monitor, Sophie stirred, then settled. The moment cracked like glass. I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked into the nursery. She was still asleep, her small chest rising and falling, one hand curled beneath her cheek. I knelt beside the crib and rested my forehead on the edge. I didn't have the job yet. I didn't know what would happen next. But I had something better than certainty. I had hope. That night, Ethan came home later than usual. His tie was loose, his shirt half untucked, and his eyes glassier than I liked. "Out drinking?" I asked, too tired to censor myself. He blinked slowly. "I needed time." I nodded. "I'm ready." He looked at me, confused. "Ready for what?" "To stop waiting for you to notice me," I said softly. He didn't respond, just walked past me into the living room, opened the fridge, and pulled out a beer. And as I watched him, his shoulders hunched, his energy dulled. I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was simply done. Later that night, I called Jessica to thank her. She picked up on the second ring. "How'd it go?" I remembered who I was, I said. "Thank you." She paused, then said, "Now you just need an exit plan. You don't have to do everything at once, but you can't stay stuck." She was right. This wasn't just about a job, or money, or pride. This was about safety, because Ethan had never hit me, never screamed, never left bruises, but his control was just as real, just as dangerous. It was time to find the door and walk through it before it vanished. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Sophie was still asleep, curled like a comma in her crib, and the house was wrapped in that strange silence that only exists before dawn, when even the walls seem to hold their breath. I stood in the kitchen with a mug of tea growing cold in my hands and stared out the window at the backyard. It was a Tuesday, Ethan's office day. He'd be gone by 9, and I had a list, not a dramatic list, not how to escape in the dead of night, or how to ruin a man, just practical things. A new bank account under my name, a printed resume, phone numbers for local daycare centers, a short list of women's shelters, just in case. I wrote it in pencil. Something about the softness of graphite felt safer than ink, less final, easier to erase if needed. But I didn't erase a single line. That afternoon, I took Sophie on a walk. Instead of the park, we ended up at a small daycare on the edge of town, Maple Grove, a place Jessica had once mentioned. It was painted pale yellow with flower boxes under the windows and murals of animals on the outside wall. A woman named Rosa greeted us at the door. She had kind eyes and wore a necklace with tiny alphabet beads that spelled out patience. "Trial visit," she asked with a smile. I nodded, heart pounding. Just a few hours. I want to see how she does. Inside, the center was quiet but warm. Wooden toys, soft rugs, cheerful chaos. Sophie hesitated at first, gripping my shirt with tiny fingers. But 10 minutes later, she was crawling toward a stack of blocks, giggling as another baby knocked them over. I stood at the window for a long time, watching her, not feeling guilt, but something else. Permission. After I left Maple Grove, I stopped at a gas station on the way home and paid cash for a burner phone. I slid it into the pocket of my diaper bag, hidden beneath the wipes and snacks. That night, I called the shelter. I didn't give my name, just asked a few questions. The woman on the line, another Rosa, oddly enough, answered them with a calm steadiness that made my throat ache. She didn't push, didn't judge, just said, "When you're ready, we'll be here." When I got home, Ethan was already on the couch. He looked up from his phone as I entered, then at the 2 small shopping bags in my hands. "You were out." "Yes," I said. "Groceries." He glanced at the bags. "Doesn't seem like much." It wasn't. He didn't push further, just went back to his phone. Later that night, as I bathed Sophie, I caught myself humming a soft tune. Familiar, but I couldn't place it. I hadn't hummed in months, maybe years. After she fell asleep, I sat on the bed, staring at my list again. Bank account, check. Daycare, check. Backup phone, check. I hadn't told Jessica, hadn't told anyone, because this wasn't a plan I could share. Not yet, not until I was gone. The next morning, as I was folding laundry, my phone rang. It was my mother. She never called out of the blue. Her voice was cautious. "Hi, sweetie. I got a call from Ethan." The blood drained from my face. "What did he say?" She hesitated. "He said he's worried about you, that maybe you're pulling away, that you've been paranoid, maybe depressed. He said you're working too much, that you're distant from the baby." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "I'm fine," I said tightly. "Don't listen to him." "I just wanted to check," she replied gently. "Maybe talk to someone, just in case." After we hung up, I walked into the living room and stood in front of him. "You called my mother?" He didn't flinch. "I told her I was concerned." "You told her I was unstable." "I told her the truth," he said, his voice flat. "Which, by the way, I am concerned. You've been different." I stared at him, and for the first time, I understood what he was really afraid of. I was no longer under control. The next week passed in a blur of tension, so thick it felt like a second skin. Ethan wasn't cruel. He wasn't angry. He was careful. He started bringing me coffee again in the mornings, black, just how I used to like it. He asked questions he hadn't bothered with in months. "How's Sophie sleeping these days?" "Still freelancing." "You seem tired. Want me to watch her for a bit?" It would have seemed kind to anyone else, but to me, it felt like surveillance dressed as concern. Every word was a feeler, every smile a test. I played along, smiled back, said thank you, let him hold Sophie for 20 minutes while I rested in the bedroom, quietly checking my burner phone for messages from the shelter and confirming my first payment had landed in the new account. He had no idea how far I'd already gone. One evening, I came home from a walk with Sophie and found him seated in his leather chair, hands folded, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. "You've been busy," he said. I paused, keys still in hand. "Excuse me." He tilted his head. "Work, baby. Always doing something lately. For someone who used to be exhausted all the time, you've got a lot of energy now." I swallowed. "I guess I'm getting better at balance." "Balance," he repeated slowly, like he was tasting the word. He didn't smile, just watched as I walked past him, every muscle in my back pulled tight. My hands were shaking when I reached the bedroom, and I locked the door before I even realized what I was doing. The next morning, I took Sophie to daycare again. "Trial week," I told Rosa. She smiled, nodded, and showed me to the toddler room where Sophie eagerly crawled toward a table of finger paints. I watched her through the glass for nearly 10 minutes. She didn't even glance back. She was ready. Afterward, I drove across town under a different name and toured 3 apartment complexes. I didn't submit an application. Not yet. But I took photos, asked about deposits, memorized street names. When I got home, Ethan was in the kitchen. He looked up immediately, eyes scanning the bags in my hands. "Groceries again?" he asked. "Yes." He looked past me at the 2 small paper sacks, barely enough for a day. "Doesn't seem like much." "It wasn't just diapers and milk," I said softly. He didn't reply. That night, while bathing Sophie, I caught myself singing. Not a lullaby, an old jazz tune my father used to hum when cooking Sunday breakfast. It was the strangest thing, hearing my own voice like that. Natural, unafraid. After she was asleep, I folded laundry and went through my checklist again. Passwords, changed. Banking, secured. Cash, hidden in a tampon box under the sink, double-bagged. Shelter address, memorized. Routes, mapped, printed, folded into Sophie's diaper bag. I told no one, not even Jessica, because the moment someone else knew, it would no longer be mine. Then came the phone call I didn't expect. "Jessica." "Hey," she said. "I just wanted to give you a heads up. Elise forwarded your test project to the senior partners. They're impressed. I think you're about to get an offer." My breath caught. An offer? Part-time remote, with benefits. I blinked hard. "Jessica, you earned this," she said. "All of it." After we hung up, I sat on the floor in the hallway outside Sophie's room. The house was silent, but my pulse pounded like a war drum. This was happening. It was really happening. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I just breathed. Deeply. Freely. For the first time in years. 2 days later, the offer letter came in. Part-time. Remote. Real salary. Healthcare. Respect. I printed it out and slid it into a folder with Sophie's daycare schedule, the apartment applications, and my new passport copies. My escape was no longer an idea. It had shape, weight, paperwork. That night, Ethan came home early. I was in the kitchen, wiping down counters, humming softly. I didn't hear him come in until he cleared his throat behind me. "I brought wine," he said, holding up a bottle like a peace offering. I froze for half a second, then nodded. "Okay." He poured 2 glasses, sat on the couch, and patted the cushion next to him. "We don't do this enough," he said. "Just talk." I sat, careful to keep my body angled, slightly away. His arm rested along the back of the couch, not touching me, but hovering like a shadow. "You've been different lately," he said. "Busier. More private." "I've had a lot on my plate," I replied, measured. He nodded. "Still, I want you to know if something's wrong, you can say it. We're a team." I turned to him, slowly, and met his gaze head-on. This wasn't kindness. It was a net. "It's just work stress," I said lightly. "I'm adjusting." He studied me for a second too long, then smiled. "Well, I'm glad you're feeling productive again. You're always at your best when you've got a purpose." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. Later, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked calm. Too calm. Like I'd rehearsed that scene 100 times. Because I had. Under the sink, in a box labeled extra soap, was a plastic bag filled with emergency cash and the burner phone. Triple wrapped. Ready. I checked the time. 4 a.m. I lay beside him for hours, pretending to sleep, listening to his breathing, slow, even entitled. Like he'd won. Like he still believed I was staying. The next day, I drove Sophie to daycare for a full-day trial. She ran to Rosa with open arms, her little sneakers squeaking on the floor. I watched through the glass for a moment, then stepped away. I didn't cry. I felt steady, focused. Afterward, I stopped by a grocery store across town, paid cash, and picked up 2 things, a small travel duffel and a portable charger. When I got home, Ethan was waiting by the window. "You were gone a while," he said. "I had errands." He stepped closer. Too close. "You don't have to lie," he said softly. "If you're meeting someone, just say it." I blinked. "I'm not." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Okay." That night, while Sophie slept, he sat beside me on the bed and placed his hand gently on my thigh. "You know," he murmured, "I really do want us to get back to being a team." I looked down at his hand. It felt like a weight, a claim. "I'm tired," I said, and stood up. He didn't stop me, didn't raise his voice, didn't touch me again. But I saw it, the flicker of something cold behind his eyes. He knew, and now so did I. He wasn't going to let me walk out easily, but I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside him, eyes open in the dark, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. Steady, unbothered, as if everything still belonged to him. The house, the silence, me. He didn't know I had already packed Sophie's clothes into the duffel, that I had printed directions to the shelter and sealed them inside a book titled Baby's First Words, that I had rehearsed this escape in my head so many times it no longer felt like a plan. It felt like a memory waiting to happen. At 3:14 a.m., I slipped out of bed. The floorboards creaked like they were warning him, but he didn't stir. I padded down the hallway, past the wedding photo, past the untouched dinner dishes, into Sophie's room. She was curled beneath her blanket, breathing softly. I crouched beside her and whispered, "It's time, baby." She didn't wake, not really, just stirred slightly as I lifted her, wrapped her in the soft gray blanket, and pressed a kiss to her forehead. I held her to my chest and walked back down the hall. Then I saw him, Ethan, standing in the doorway, barefoot, arms crossed. His eyes locked on mine. No rage, no shouting, just presence. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. For one long second, time stretched between us, tight and brittle. Then I stepped forward, one foot, then another. He didn't move, didn't block me, but his gaze followed every inch of me, like he could still lay claim just by watching. I walked past him, out the door, into the cold, early morning air. My car was already packed. I slid Sophie into her seat with trembling hands and started the engine. As the headlights cut across the quiet street, I glanced in the mirror. Ethan still stood in the doorway, still watching, but he didn't follow. I didn't wait to see if he would. I didn't give him that power. I drove through Charleston's sleeping streets, each red light a threat, each turn a breath held. At 4:43 a.m., I arrived. The shelter was an old brick building tucked between a church and a community center. The porch light was still on. A woman stood at the door in a gray cardigan, her face soft and unstartled. "Olivia," she asked gently. I nodded, holding Sophie tighter. "Yes." She opened the door wider. "Come in." Inside, it smelled like chamomile and warm bread. Someone was baking. Somewhere, a child was crying softly. It wasn't peaceful, not exactly, but it was safe. She led me to a small room, 2 beds, a crib, a lamp. I sat on the edge of the mattress and placed Sophie down. She turned over in her sleep, unfazed, content. The woman, Rosa, just like the one from daycare, brought me a glass of water and a warm towel. I thanked her with my eyes more than my voice. After she left, I sat in the stillness, my hands in my lap. I had done it. I had left, and no one had stopped me, not even him. The sun was starting to rise, streaks of pink and gold threading the window. I watched it without moving, letting the light fall across my arms. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel afraid. I just felt real, like I had stepped back into my own body after years of watching from the outside, like I had finally taken up space I had been shrinking from for far too long. It had been 3 weeks since I left. Sophie had settled into Maple Grove like she'd been born for it, coloring, babbling, waving goodbye to me each morning like I was just another mom with somewhere to be. I had moved into a small rental unit above a florist shop on the quieter side of town. It smelled like roses and fresh soil, and for the first time in years, I didn't live surrounded by silence or tension. I had a job now, a routine, a door I could lock without fear. Then the invitation came, a message from Nathan. Claire, and I wanted you to speak again. Just a little something, like at the wedding. People are still talking about what you said. I almost laughed when I read it, but I said yes. The reception was smaller this time, a quiet, post-wedding dinner for friends and family who hadn't been able to attend the big event. It was held at a cozy restaurant just outside the city, a brick building with ivy creeping up its sides, candles flickering on every table. I arrived early alone, wearing a soft gray dress, hair down, no diaper bag slung across my shoulder. No Ethan walking 3 steps ahead. He was already there when I walked in, sitting at the back, arms folded, pretending I didn't exist. I saw the moment he noticed me. His jaw tightened, his gaze flicked down, measuring, calculating. He was probably already rehearsing what he'd say afterward to spin the narrative in his favor. That I was unstable, that I'd abandoned him, that I was going through something. He had told his mother I was in a facility. She had texted me a week ago, unsure whether to believe him. I didn't respond, because I didn't need to explain anymore. Nathan raised his glass halfway through dinner, smiling toward the center of the room. We'd like to invite someone special to say a few words again, he said. Someone who reminded us all what it means to be seen. I stood. There wasn't a microphone this time, just me in a room full of familiar faces and unfinished stories. I wasn't planning to speak, I began, but Nathan asked, and I think sometimes silence is just a different kind of performance. A quiet laugh rippled near the center. I spent a long time believing that love meant staying quiet, that if I just did everything right, folded the towel, smiled at the right times, kept the baby quiet during meetings, eventually the love would come back. I looked up. I thought the coldness was stress. The silence was exhaustion. The flinching was just a phase. I let my gaze drift to Ethan, who hadn't moved. But it wasn't. Someone across the room cleared their throat. Chairs shifted. I held steady. It was the sound of someone slowly forgetting that I was human. I paused. No one spoke. I left, I said clearly, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Not because I didn't love him, but because I finally started loving myself more. There it was, the stillness, not awkward, not uncertain, just still. I didn't need applause. I didn't need permission. I stepped back, nodded to Nathan, and returned to my seat. When I glanced toward the back, Ethan was gone. Maybe for a breath of air. Maybe because he couldn't breathe at all. After the dinner, I didn't wait around. I didn't want questions or hugs, or that subtle pity some people slip into their smiles. I just grabbed my coat, stepped into the cool night air, and walked to my car. The streets were quiet. My footsteps felt solid, real. When I got home, Sophie was already asleep. The babysitter, Jessica's cousin, had left a note on the counter. She ate all her peas and asked for you once, but not with tears, just curiosity, like she already knows you're always coming back. I stood there in the middle of my tiny kitchen, holding that piece of paper like it was something sacred, because it was. I was coming back, to myself, to my daughter, to a life that wasn't wrapped in whispers and manipulation. Later that night, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. There were emails, deadlines, a logo that needed refining. But before I clicked on any of it, I opened a blank document, and I started to write. Note à résumé, not a strategy deck, just words, about what it felt like to disappear in your own marriage, about learning to exist again without apology, about how silence can be more violent than yelling, about how love that asks you to shrink isn't love, it's control with perfume on. I didn't know what I was writing toward. Maybe a blog post, maybe a letter no one would read. But it poured out of me like breath I'd been holding for years. I stopped around midnight, closed the laptop, sat in the stillness. then walked into Sophie's room. She was sprawled sideways in her crib, blanket twisted around one leg, one chubby hand flung over her head like a tiny queen who ruled dreams. I bent down, kissed her temple, and whispered, "We're okay now." And we were. Not perfect, not finished, but okay. The next morning, as we walked to daycare, Sophie pointed at a squirrel and squealed with laughter. I laughed too, not because I had to, not to prove I was fine, just because it was funny, because I could. A week later, I got a voicemail from Ethan. His voice was calm, almost kind. "I don't know what stories you're telling, Olivia, but they're hurting people. You should think about Sophie. Think about what you're doing to our family." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. He had spent years making sure I stayed small, quiet, tame, and now my silence was gone. My obedience had expired. I wasn't his anything anymore. I was mine. There's this thing people say when you leave a toxic marriage. You're so strong. But strength isn't always loud. It's not slamming doors or shouting in courtrooms. Sometimes strength is driving away at 4 a.m. with a baby and a duffel bag and no idea what comes next. Sometimes it's staying soft after you've been made to feel hard. Sometimes it's saying, "I deserve more," and believing it even if your voice shakes. So if you're reading this or hearing it, and you've been made to feel like you're just a role someone else wrote for you, a carrier, a placeholder, a shadow, let me remind you, you are not invisible. You never were. You're not just anything. You are everything they pretended not to see, and you deserve to be seen.